Hi, boys and girls. Our story today is called When God Provided. Pastor Warren, he and his wife had been missionaries to Papua New Guinea and that area of the world for some time, and then World War II struck, and all the missionaries were sent home. The Warrens wondered if they would ever get to go back to their mission land. But finally, when the war was over, the mission board sent them again to Papua New Guinea. Well, when they came, they brought lots of supplies with them because by now they had 4 children to provide for. They were so glad to be back to their mission work, there where the school was and where the church was. They loved all those little black children that filled the school. Well, months had gone by, and it had become the rainy season. There was torrential rains, and the rivers had all flooded, and the ocean inlets now were almost unpassable. The waves were huge, and the bar that they had to cross with the boats to get into the river was so rough that the supply boats just couldn't come in. Well, there was no place to go to buy groceries. There was no grocery stores. And yes, there were the local foods that they could eat. But there's nothing like home food. And they knew when they moved there that they would have to order groceries 6 months at a time. Can you imagine figuring out how much of everything to order for 6 months of food for a family of 6? That was going to be a lot of food and a lot of their budget. Well, they had ordered food from Australia, and it was supposed to come by boat, cross that bar, and go up the river. And they would meet it at the dock when the messenger came to say it was coming. Mother was really anxious. They had been out of flour to make bread for weeks and weeks. And what child doesn't love bread? The weather was so bad that when the boat was supposed to arrive, it didn't come. Then they were told there would be another boat 2 weeks later. And then they received a message that the place that they had ordered their food from was on strike, and it had never been loaded into a boat. Then, when they knew that that food had indeed been put on a boat coming to them, they had waited that 2 weeks, only for the runner to come to the mission and say, "We are so sorry, but the boat, it could not come across the bar." Well, another 2 weeks went by. Now the sole amount of food in their household was 1 can of canned cauliflower. I love cauliflower, but if you've ever eaten canned cauliflower, it's not the most exciting thing to have for dinner. They had 1 can of cauliflower and 1 jar of orange marmalade. That was all. And their children, there were things they could get there locally. But the children's little tummies were not doing well on the local foods. They weren't accustomed to them, and they started to lose weight. Now, any mama knows When your little tiny children start to lose weight, you worry. And every day, the missionary, his wife, and their 4 children would plead with God, please send the boat with the food on it. Please send the boat with the flour on it. And they would wait. Finally, a runner came running up the path through the jungle and said, we got a message that a boat was coming across the bar. And it was Friday. And the missionary said, we'll meet it at the dock on the river. So he went to the school and he gathered 12 of his strongest young men that were students there at the school. And they set off down the path. Now, this path was just wide enough for one person, so they had to walk single file. And it was going to take them about an hour and a half of walking to get to where the dock was on that big river. They were so excited. He took 12 because it was going to take a lot of strong young men, plus the missionary, to carry enough food to last for that family of 6 for 6 months. Well, they headed off. It was an okay day. They headed off down through the jungle. And when they finally got to that dock, the missionary, he looked down the river. He thought that the boat would beat them there. All 12 of those boys and the missionary sat down on the dock to wait. And they waited, and they waited, and they waited. They waited for hours, and there was no boat. Finally, down that path, coming from the path that would have led to the ocean, there came a runner. And he said, I'm so sorry, Master. That's what they called the missionary. The boat couldn't make it across the bar. The water was too rough. I'm sorry. I know you're waiting for your food. I am so sorry. The missionary was discouraged, but he wanted God to know that he still trusted him. So he had all 12 of those young men and himself. They knelt down right there on the dock, and the missionary prayed, Father, we don't know why this is happening, but we still trust you to bring us food. Please send it soon. You know our need. Well, they got up and they started back down the jungle path. Well, not too far from that river, back down the path, there was a plantation. The missionary got an idea. Several weeks before, he had given the plantation manager some big sheets of like a mesh because that plantation manager had wanted to build a trap to trap fish on the river. Well, the missionary thought, well, who knows? So he took his 12 young men and he went down that little path to the plantation. And the manager saw him coming and he said, hello, friend. And the missionary, he said, how does your fish trap work? Is it working well? And the manager said, it worked fabulous. That is, until the river flooded and all this rain that's happening was going on. There hasn't been any fish in it since. And I check it every morning. And the missionary, he said, could we check it? The plantation manager, he said, I checked it this morning and there was not one fish in it. So you really don't need to check it again. He said, all right. Well, we'll see you again later when we come to pick up our food from the cargo boat. So he started down the trail. And they were only like 10 minutes down the trail. And the missionary, in his head, he kept thinking, go back and ask to look again in that fish trap. He was kind of embarrassed. He'd already kind of asked him twice, but maybe it was God telling him to go back. So he turned around with his young men and he went back. And the manager said, oh, back so soon? And he said, yes, I was wondering if the boys and I could pull up your fish trap. The manager said, well, I really don't care. I don't think there's anything in it, but because it hasn't been set. And there, from the edge of the river, they could see the trap. Now, that trap was a big circle. It was about, let's see, I can't make it and you still see it, but 3 feet wide. So 3 feet circle. And it was 8 feet long. And it had ropes on it. So when it was actually set, that they could pull it in. Well, the manager said, I never reset it after the last time. I thought I might as well wait until all this flooding and rain stopped. So you can see it out there, and he pointed. And that big tube that was the trap, when it was set, went long ways on the water. That way the fish could swim inside and get trapped in it. But because it wasn't set, it still had its ropes on it, but it was turned this way, up and down in the water, and about a foot of it was sticking out at the top of the water. Well, anybody with any sense could see that if the bottom of the fish trap, which was an open circle, was flat on the bottom of the river, and the top of it was sticking up in the air, that there wouldn't be any fish in it. But the missionary, he felt kind of foolish, but he had the boys come over, and they started pulling in those ropes. And they pulled that fish trap up out of the river onto the bank. And wonder of wonders, inside of it was this huge fish. So huge, it weighed 25 pounds. And what made it even more amazing to the missionary was that it was a barramundi fish. And that fish was a clean fish. We're told in the Bible what's clean and what's unclean as far as meat goes. And fish had to have fins and scales to be a clean fish. They were fish that didn't go eat the garbage off the bottom and stuff. So they were fish that were okay for people to eat. And the missionary, he looked at that big fish, and already, like I told you, the manager had said, anything that's in it you can have. Well, he thanked the manager for that big fish, and the young men that were with him got a pole out of the jungle there. I don't know if it was bamboo or what it was. And somehow they tied that big 25-pound fish onto that pole. And two of those young men, one put it on this shoulder, and the other man got himself back further back and put the post on his shoulder as well. And they started down the trail. Well, the missionary was thinking, it's a clean fish. But they hadn't eaten any kind of meat in their house for years and years. But it was a clean fish. And so while they were going down the trail, every once in a while, there was little paths that went off the trail, off into the jungle. And on one of these little paths that came out, the missionary saw a beautiful, dark-skinned Papua New Guinean lady. And there she stood, right where the path they were on and that little path met the big path. There she stood. And when the missionary got close to her with all his young men behind him, she said to him, "Master, I have a gift for you." And he said, "A gift for me? What is it?" And she said, "You see." So he turned to his young men and he said, "Would you go over to the lady and see what the gift is that she has for me?" And they got a puzzled look on their face, and they said, "Master, there is no lady there." And the missionary, he was still kind of looking at that fish, and he turned around to them and he said, "I said, go ask the lady what gift she has for us." And they said, "There is no lady there." Now the missionary was getting a little bit annoyed, and he turned to them and he said, "That lady that's right there on that little path coming into the big path, see, she's right." And she was gone. She was just gone. But there, sitting at the edge of the path, was a big wheat sack. Well, grain sacks were generally made out of burlap, and you seldom saw them on Papua New Guinea. But there it sat. And he said to one of the young men, "Go get that sack." And they picked it up and they brought it over to the missionary. And the missionary opened it up and he looked inside. And it was more than half full of yams, yellow yams. We don't see yellow yams in the United States very often now, but they're like a sweet potato or the orange yams that we have like for Thanksgiving dinner. And the missionary knew that they didn't grow in this part of Papua New Guinea. It was a long, long ways of walking to where they grew. And he was standing there thinking, God has provided us a fish and some yams to eat. Isn't he good? Well, then they thanked God for the food. And as they were walking down the trail, he heard his boys, as he called the men, for the young guys from the school. They were saying, it had to have been a beautiful angel. Why didn't we get to see the angel? It had to have been an angel. Why didn't we at least get to hear her? And then they said something very sad. Do you suppose it's because we're black and he's white? And the missionary, he turned around and he said, oh no, boys, it's nothing like that. I'm sure it was an angel, but she had to leave for some reason. And it's not. God loves you just as much as he loves me. God made you the color you are, and he loves you. I don't know why you didn't get to see the angel, but as they walked home, the boy said, at least we got to be close to an angel. They went on down that path through the jungle till they got to the campus of that school. Now, the teacher, the missionary, the pastor, he was a little bit of everything. His house was up on the hill above the campus, and it looked down at all the little buildings down here. So when he got to the school, he used the school telephone and he called his wife. And he had to tell her that the boat hadn't come in, so they didn't have the groceries. And she started to cry. And he said, oh, honey, I'm sorry. I feel bad, too, that it hasn't come yet. I know our children are hungry, but if I brought a fish home, would you cook it? And do you know what she said? I'd cook it, scales and all. He said, well, I'm bringing a 25-pound fish and a half a bag, a half of a grain sack full of yellow yams. And she said, oh, she knew their children would love yams, and they would probably eat that fish, even though they hadn't eaten it before. So he hurried home with that fish and that bag of yams. And that night for supper, they had cooked fish and yams. Sabbath morning breakfast, they had yams and fish. That lunchtime, they had fish and yams, and for supper, they had yams and fish. And the next morning, they had fish and yams. And then a runner came. He said, the boat made it across the bar. Come to the dock. The boat's coming, come. So the missionary and those 12 young men quickly made their way that hour and a half down through the jungle, and sure enough, their boat came in. God provided by sending an angel with yellow yams that didn't grow in that area, that babies, small children could easily eat. God provided by sending a 25-pound fish that the only way it could have gotten into that fish trap was jumping straight up out of the river into the top of that fish trap. There's no question as to who provided for those missionaries' needs. God had provided. Now they had nothing but prayers of thanksgiving. And if you're ever in a bad situation, remember, God can provide. Thank you, boys and girls, and I'll see you next week. Have a good week. Bye-bye now.